do you see social media going, and what do you see? What do you think can be done against it or for it, or use it in the right way? And how have you dealt with the issue over the last couple of months?
I'm an ardent First Amendment supporter for obvious reasons. So, for example, when I see anti-Semitic tweets coming my way, I don't block these people. I want to see what they're saying, and often I will take a screenshot and tweet that to show people what's coming my way. I just believe that these people should be out-argued and shouted down rather than blocked. And I think but I think that networks like Facebook and Twitter do have to find a balance between restricting free speech and reining in abuse and harassment and incitement toward violence. Through Twitter, through the web, people found my address, my phone number, and I was getting phone calls and people ordering caskets for me and homicide cleanups to my apartment, which is, I mean, that it's a fine line. It's something that, we're kind of every step of the way in the development of social media has been uncharted territory, and we're just going further and further into it. I think we'll figure out a way to sort through it, but I think it has to be a fine line between completely shutting these people down, because again, I'd never block these people. I want to know what they're saying. I want to know where I'd rather see them than not see them. I'd rather that they be visible than lurking in corners where they're, I think, far more dangerous.
Jeffrey, you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, I much prefer the Nazis to Hamas, though, for a number of reasons. I'd take something else entirely, obviously, if I were given the choice. No, but I was just thinking about this. We were talking about this before. And this refers back to what Yossi was talking about a little bit. The Nazis are so over the top. I mean, the oven stuff. I mean, they're not creative
they're really
either.
Good at Photoshop.
They Photoshop you in ovens. They Photoshop you in gas chambers. It's really unbelievable. But it's so overt that it's very hard to argue something that you hear on the left side of the spectrum on Twitter and social media, which is, oh no, it's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism. And the thing about so I appreciate the overtness of it in a kind of way, and I find what's actually probably more pernicious. I would associate myself with Yossi's comments. That I don't believe that there's a functional difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. If you define anti-Zionism as a belief that the Jews should not have a state, that is an anti-Jewish position to take. But what's happening in the left is huge word games going on about, oh, this is not anti-Semitism, and so I wouldn't say that I find it refreshing that the straightforwardness of the Nazis. The only Nazis, I've said this before, the only Nazis on Twitter that I really fear are the ones who actually know how to spell, because none of them know. They really are terrible spellers, and I assume that a lack of grammar is self-limiting in a kind of way. That Hitler could spell. The question that the question we don't know is how many are there, and what activates it, and how big is this network? Clearly, these are people in the main. I'm sure your stalkers are the same, who, when you go to their accounts, almost invariably have associated themselves in some way or another with Donald Trump. It's just a fact that the Venn diagram is that's what it is. It's the huge overlay. They believe, and this is something that's worthy of more journalistic exploration, they believe, even though Donald Trump has been largely silent on questions about Jews, largely, they believe that somehow Donald Trump is leading to a white nationalist renaissance in America. Their target online are the Jews, though Donald Trump has other groups that he's currently been discussing. Some of you may notice that. And so we're at the very beginning of an interesting and very fraught process of trying to understand what's going on in the sort of this, when you're lifting up these rocks and finding these people, including how many are there. We don't know the answer to that.
Well, what I can say is, unfortunately, we've had in Europe quite a little bit of an experience, and we have seen that these groups are extremely well organized. And I hope that this is not going to be that Europe is not in that sense a laboratory, and that we're now seeing sort of a trend that will develop in the same way.
Could you answer a question for us? Not that I'm trying to seize the microphone here or anything, but could you were on the front lines of fighting Dieudonné, and you're fighting a lot of really vicious Nazi style, neo-Nazi style anti-Semitism, and AJC and other organizations have succeeded to some degree in marginalizing that narrative, that phenomenon in France. And you've done that because France has a different relationship to what we would consider First Amendment issues. What is it that worked in Europe?
No, absolutely. Well, I find myself now in the very strange position of not being a moderator anymore, but yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
It's all right. But
I told you I was going to do this beforehand.
The problem is when you speak to a journalist, you automatically transform yourself into a journalist. To be very
Simone was a great help, by the way, to me when I was in Europe doing the series of articles, long articles on European Jewry. AJC plays a very important role in that struggle. I should just say that, even though it sounds like it's a nice thing to say. I'll say it anyway.
Thank you.
And she's at the front. She's at the front of the front line, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, to answer your question, and then I'll go back to my moderating status. We have a different approach to the First Amendment, and I think to a great extent, the reasons why we have been able to marginalize some of those very vile anti-Semites online, like Dieudonné, like Alain Soral, was because we have penalized them, and we have put fines, put them in front of the courts, because we consider that anti-Semitism, incitement to violence, is actually not an opinion; it's a crime. And I think also over the years we've been able to prove that there is a very strict correlation between what is going on social media and actually people dying afterwards. There will obviously be questions, I think, for you in the future. It has been our approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that the United States needs to take the same approach. But for us, where the situation is indeed very, very grave, it has been the only way of combating the problem. So actually, now that we are in Europe, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject on that. In the U.S., what I found, and as many women, especially female writers who have been subjected to this kind of harassment online, have found that the law in the U.S. really lags far behind the technology. And so when I was forced to call the police and the police officer came to my home, he literally said, well, we can't do anything until a crime occurs. To which I said, I hope, my parents ask you to reconsider. But there really isn't much that they can do. You can trace these people to a proxy somewhere in France, and you can break through that proxy, and it's a Tor. And under U.S. law, even if you find the exact computer from which these even if anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic speech were made illegal in the U.S., which I don't agree with, even if you found the specific computer from which that tweet was sent, it's basically impossible in an American court to prove that a specific person sent that tweet. So our laws need to kind of catch up, but also take our First Amendment traditions into it.
The AJC is doing it. One is to promote involvement in various policy debates. Second, to generate a new generation that's involved in these issues. But I would think more than anything, and I've actually made it the priority for my organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, is to produce a next generation that understands why the world matters, that isolationism is not a serious or a wise option, and that will try to promote involvement, that whether it's strategic, political, economic, military, what have you, in the world, that essentially will understand that that this society, or indeed no society, can be walled off. There's no gated communities in a global world. and that there needs to be serious involvement. I just say 10 more seconds. The Middle East is a little bit of a warning about what happens when global involvement essentially falls off. And it's a stark lesson that the world, for those of you who took Economics 101.
And since it's, people have been keeping count, and this is all in the service of, we're tightening our belts in order to pursue our adventures abroad. And that means upholding actors like Assad. It means upholding actors like Saddam Hussein way back when. Like Jeffrey said, this is not a better actor than the US. And Russians are prepared to tolerate this at home. Like the hardship that comes from this kind of foreign policy, the sanctions, the tanking oil price, they're okay with that as long as Russia is ascendant on the world stage. And they're kind of primed for blood at this point. They want to see more of it. The concert that a Russian symphony orchestra had in Palmyra after it was recaptured from ISIS is similar to the concert that Russia gave in South Ossetia after it bit off that chunk off of Georgia. This is something that is very much in Putin's playbook. We're going to see a lot more of it in the future, I think, especially if the US continues to pull back. And what you're seeing in the Russian media, which is controlled by the Kremlin, is an active throwing in for Donald Trump. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to weigh in politically, but I'm just telling you that the Kremlin has weighed in politically, and pretty much every news broadcast is talking about how Trump is great and Trump is going to reestablish a friendship with Russia. And really what that means is that America is going to beat a retreat. It's going to become more isolationist, which will give more room to Russia to maneuver. Hillary is evil and a warmonger, and she hates Russia. Bernie Sanders is good for attacking her from the left. So the Kremlin is very clear on who it wants to win.
The vote in England and the Brexit vote, which shows the challenge to, the European project. And Europe itself was such an accomplishment. When you think about what happened in the 40s and 50s between Germany and France, what began as the coal and steel community became the European community, became the European Union. The whole idea was to knit Europe together in such a way that you would never again have conflict on a large scale, that it would become unthinkable because the societies and economies would become too integrated. And there was a general trajectory in that direction. And what worries me now, to take a step back, is I see that trajectory under challenge. And rather than Europe becoming more integrated, it's becoming less integrated, and the consensus is moving away from that. It's almost as if people have forgotten some of the historical impulses that got Europe to, in a sense, that wrote 20th century history for worse and for better. And I just think that Europe is in play historically today in ways that we literally could not have imagined only 3 or 4 years ago. It's happened with stunning speed, and I just think it's one of those things I talked before. It's one of the things that we thought was a given, that Europe was basically okay and peaceful and the rest, and suddenly we're waking up to the reality that even Europe is not a given. And I just think that needs to be something that we remain mindful of. You want to say something on this before we get this?
Just let me just interject very quickly, because it's a semi-related.
Very quickly.
Don't worry, it's going to be extremely quick, although it's getting longer by the second. It's very interesting, because what Richard is describing is that we're living in an amazing time. And what I was thinking of was Julia just mentioned something that's impossible to think about 20 years ago. If you said to somebody 20 years ago that in 2016 the Kremlin would be backing the Republican candidate for president of the United States, they would say, you're on meth, you need help. But we're living in a period in which everything that we've supposed about international stability is out the window.
But I was going to say that especially among the younger generation that doesn't remember a lot of this consensus, especially around foreign affairs, a lot of these things that we grew up with as givens, a peaceful, prosperous Europe, an America where racism and sexism and anti-Semitism doesn't exist, and it's your paranoid grandmother's fantasy. All these things, I personally could not have imagined seeing the kinds of things I've been seeing on Twitter in America in 2016. And I think a lot of people my age and younger who have been seeing it are extremely shocked, because they certainly thought that this was a hatred that we'd long